Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this strategic conversation. I'm Jamie Shea, and I'm a senior fellow at Friends of Europe. I'm delighted to welcome as my guest today, Merle Maigret. Merle is Estonian. She worked with me some years back in the private office of the Secretary General of NATO, dealing with policy planning. Then she went on to have a very illustrious career as an advisor to two Estonian presidents, maybe more, Merle, but I know it's certainly two. She was the director of the well-known NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. After that, she finished, at least for now, her government service, moved to the private sector, and currently she is the senior expert on cybersecurity at the e-Governance Academy. And maybe Merle will tell us in a moment a little bit more about what that involves. I'm also hoping to have a second guest today, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, a very well-known former British diplomat, and someone who's also served in government as a former Minister of State for Security and Counter-Terrorism. Pauline is also a trustee of Friends of Europe, so I very much hope that she will be able to connect, at least before the end of our strategic conversation today, and to contribute. But in the meantime, I'm delighted, Merle, to welcome you here. Now, I hope in a moment we're going to put on the screen for you, here they go, our 10 key recommendations. These come from a tabletop exercise that Friends of Europe conducted this time last year with senior officials from the European Union, from NATO, from governments of those two international organizations, as well as representatives of the private sector, where we wanted to look at the resilience of Europe's critical infrastructure, which has come under a lot of strain, as we know, in recent times, from a whole series of phenomena, whether it be blackouts, whether it be energy disruptions and shortages, power failures, whether it be from extreme weather events, whether it be from state-directed hybrid warfare and sabotage activities, the type of cyber attacks that Merle deals with on a daily basis, and more recently, of course, the stresses on supply chains arising from the COVID-19 crisis. So those were our 10 recommendations. A year has gone by, a very eventful year. This time last November, COVID-19 was beginning to spread, but we didn't know it then, nor the impact that it was going to have on our lives soon thereafter. And so 1 year later, with Merle today, what I'd like to do is a stock take on, how, are we more resilient now than we were 12 months ago? Have any of those recommendations moved forward? Are we still largely where we were then? Resilience is a bit of a buzzword around Brussels streets and circles, but I think that what we're interested in today's debate in knowing is, what does it mean in practice? What are the threats that we need to be resilient against? And are we focusing on the right things and maybe missing some of the things that we ought to be focusing on? And then finally, how do we know we're resilient? Often we only find out when something bad happens, and we either congratulate ourselves that the system worked or commiserate with each other that we were caught napping and asleep at the wheel. So how can we have a better understanding of resilience before it's tested in an extreme situation? So Merle, again, welcome to this strategic conversation. And I want to start off, as I mentioned, as I intimated just a moment ago, by asking you, if you go to bed at night and can't sleep, which I hope does not happen to you, what sort of vulnerabilities out there do you worry about? For example, this COVID experience, which I mentioned, does it sort of produce, from your point of view, particularly looking at the cyber domain, more of the same, or has it produced sort of new threats and vulnerabilities that we need to focus on? So let's start just by having your sort of general overview of the state of resilience in Europe today. Thank you.
Hi, Jamie, on my part, and thank you for the kind introduction. Indeed, when you ask what worries me about resilience, I think you're very right, and the Friends of Europe organization as such is extremely right in addressing the hybrid threats that are constantly changing. and taking multiple forms. You have election interference to covert operations, you have poisoning, to fake news, to economic sanctions and cyber attacks, to name just a few. And I think especially cyber has emerged as a major enabler in many of these hybrid threats. So when speaking of cyber, what worries me is when policymakers and analysts speak and focus at cyber attack, something similar to a nuclear strike. Of course, while these concerns remain valid, the reality, I think, that we currently face is that the global cyber threat landscape today is much more likely to produce long-term, lingering issues rather than a sudden catastrophic event. And this is rather a war of gradual weakening, not an all-out conflict. So too much hype about the cyber Armageddon detracts us, or can detract us from real cyber imperatives. So that's a small worry of mine. But of course, cyber attacks do happen. And when we look at the threat picture, I would divide it into them into three categories: theft, subversion, and sabotage. While the theft is serious and under theft, but yet conducted mostly by organized cybercriminal groups with the motivation of economic crime, you have the data theft, the piracy, the theft of intellectual property under that, and that worries me a little. Then under subversion, there is espionage and political interference. And we can talk a lot about that, and that is worrying as well. But what worries me most is in cyber attacks and where I also see some gaps in response is sabotage. And by that, I mean, first, ransomware, and second, destructive attacks. And destructive attacks are particularly worrisome because they consist of two phases. In the first phase, it involves a prepositioning, that is placing an implant in a sensitive IT network, be it energy sector, telcos, water, putting a sort of a time bomb in that can become a landing point for a country X for disrupting cyber attacks later when doing the destructive attack. And that is worrisome. I mean, we've seen this in practice back in 2015 and 16 in Ukraine, where parts of Kiev and other regions in Ukraine went black.
Yes,
and that is the key to learn how to respond to these time bombs, and what to do is to publish details in order for companies to clear them off, and others to know about this as a warning. And for that, I am a keen believer on these 10 lessons learned that you referred to earlier, that we need to have more cooperation between the private sectors and the public and the government, and more international cooperation in standing against hybrid threats.
Well, Mel, I'll come to that in a moment, because of course I'd be very interested in your ideas how we can have better cooperation there. But first, I'd like to ask you, the prevalence of cyber attacks. I mean, is it because the attackers are super intelligent and are always finding ways to get a step ahead of us with their ingenuity and their sophistication? Or is it because we on our side are not learning the basic lessons about cyber hygiene, not implementing them well enough, still negligent with our defenses? So is it because the attacker is so brilliant and the defense is lagging behind? Or are there other explanations why we haven't managed to make cyberspace a more secure domain, particularly at a time when all of us in lockdown are ever more reliant on information technology for our livelihoods and our personal well-being?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of both, actually. And cyber, ultimately, to many of us, especially many of the decision makers, and is a new area. And unfortunately, something that I've seen experiencing, especially in the private sector, is very often cybersecurity investments seen as something that goes against sort of an overall business idea of innovation and thriving, where I personally think this is not the case, but the understanding that cybersecurity is an issue that needs to be solved at the state level, strategic level, both in public and private levels, is something that is only lately starting to seek in. Cybersecurity addressed at the board level in the private sector only lately through hard-learned lessons of needing to swallow attacks or bounce back at large-scale critical attacks. That is when people learn the lesson in a hard way. Of course, COVID throughout the last 12 months has also brought out significant changes in the cyber threat landscape, because COVID has forced large-scale adopting of technology, such as the coordination of health services, teleworking, teleconferences, us here now, and so on. So working from home has given rise to new threat vectors, such as employees' remote access through public internet, cloud services, unsecured video streaming services, and mobile devices and apps. And the question is, how can we, the employers and the people, the employees, become better, improve the cyber hygiene, and make sure that when we work from home, that it remains secure. Trying to look at the glass half full, I think the COVID situation has drawn all of our attention on the digitalization, or the digital side of life and work, but also on the importance of cybersecurity. So I really hope that now, as we all experience it firsthand, that we become to recognize the issue more.
Well, you're an Estonian, as I said, and of course in 2007 it was the big attacks on Estonia that really brought cyber security to the top of the political agenda and took it from a technical issue right the way up to the strategic level. I imagine that if a similar attack occurred against Estonia now, 13 years later in 2020, your country would be far more resilient. So what have you done nationally to make yourself more resilient? And what lessons are there from your national experience that could improve resilience in other EU member states or NATO member states?
Well, I think first and foremost, there are many sides to it, and many aspects to it. From a government perspective, thinking back of the 2007 lesson learned, as well as the situation, though, the philosophy that Estonia has adopted since then was one, not so much of the technical, but a sort of like a political approach of being transparent to the world about the attack. Because ultimately, the situation of Estonia in 2007, when Estonia considered itself digitally advanced and being a sort of like high level of like master kid in the class, and yet the attack was an embarrassment. Yet the government, after a bit of a discussion, decided to be transparent about it and open about it. So first thing, being transparent, and then applying sort of like public-private partnership. But I've seen Baroness Neville joins.
I see Pauline as well, but please finish your answer though first, Merle, of course, and then I'll turn to Pauline. Okay. Pauline, it's great to see you on the screen.
Okay, first there is transparency and not being intimidated about explaining, trusting the public and the world to talk about what's happened. The second, I think, where public and private sectors in Estonia have learned to work together in advance to prepare for these kinds of attacks is two things: a shared sense of trust and a shared perspective of the threat. And that is being sort of like built through time. As a shared sense of trust is reached when you build a sort of community, you do things together, you keep up the network, you build trust over time. And a shared perception of the threat works two ways. From the private sector to the government, it is about how you inform about cyber incidents, and from the government back to the private sector, it is about how the government can get that data, generalize it and share it back so that both sides feel that it's a two-way street.
Thank you. Thanks, Merla. Pauline, it's great to see you. Let me bring you in immediately. I started off by asking Merla what worried her about resilience and what kind of issues she was focused on. I put up, you remember, from our tabletop exercise last year, our 10 recommendations, and asked if on any of them over the last 12 months you've seen any signs of progress. So it'd be good to have your overall view on how resilient are we. And one of my key questions was, how do we know if we're resilient? Because often it's only when our systems come down to our great embarrassment that we really know if we're resilient or not. So welcome, and over to you.
Well, my apologies for not having been with you earlier. I think that COVID has revealed, I think, some of the weaknesses of our whole idea of what constitutes emergency and emergency planning. I think we have, for a long time, treated emergency planning in the sense that you provided for a short time of abnormal conditions on the assumption that you were then going to revert to the status quo ante, which constituted normality. And I think what COVID has demonstrated is that you can have emergencies that last for an indefinite period of time, which are much more all-encompassing in terms of their effect on society than had previously been imagined. So that you need a much wider coordination, and which result in a new situation. So I think we're experiencing an essentially new kind of approach to what we need to have by way of resilience. And resilience really needs to be built into the normal functioning of departments of government, and indeed connections with the private sector. Now, everybody has to have capability, and indeed I would say a degree of capacity, which you might regard as otherwise redundant, to be able to switch on to that capability and those plans when a so-called emergency situation arises. And I think we're in a world too where the likelihood, let alone the impact of different situations, or ones that are outside normality, is becoming more frequent. I mean, yeah. Climate change is one example, but then I think we're in a world where it's not just threats. We have to also pay more attention than we have hitherto to hazards.
Thank you. Pauline, just a follow-up question, which I'm going to put to you, and then also to Merla. But Merla, of course, also with lots of private sector experience. I know, Pauline, you have some as well, even if most of your career, of course, has been in government service. Yeah. Which is that the private sector, as both you have pointed out, is now in the forefront of innovation, civilian technologies, and obviously trying to get things to market quickly for customer convenience and commercial advantage. So is the private sector now more security conscious? Does it take regulation to make the private sector more security conscious? Or can it be done through sort of voluntary relationships? How good is the cooperation between the private sector and government here? Well,
I think it varies.
We need to do to improve it. Please.
I think it varies according to sector. The technology sector, the defense sector, some of the utilities sectors, they're already, I think, initiated into a relationship with government, where they need to be able to provide both defense against and resilience in relation to both attack and indeed hazard. But that's not a general condition. And increasingly, I think what we find in most, certainly Western democracies, is that the private sector in the end turns out to be both a victim but also a solutions provider. I mean, if you want to buy COVID protective equipment, you have got to go to the private sector. So I think what we must learn is that there has to be a partnership between the two, and I think it is for government to take the lead, and for government to decide where are the most vulnerable and where are the most important points where that partnership needs to exist, and then they need to provide conditions in which it comes into being. And I certainly do think that the private sector has every incentive and every interest actually to respond, because in the end, if they don't respond, and when we have when we have an emergency, it's the private sector, as we see with COVID, which suffers greatly. So we have a shared interest there in long-term cooperation. And I think we're at very early stages of that.
Thanks, Pauline. Merle, as I say, you've been in the private sector in the last few years. So from that side, that end of the spectrum, how have you seen the quality of cooperation? When you were in the private sector, what would you have asked government to do for you or to do better?
Well, when I'm looking at the private sector and when I think of cybersecurity and resilience or readiness to respond to different various cybersecurity attacks, I'm first of all thinking of the essential service providers, the various sort of like power grid operators, water treatment specialists, chemical process engineers, and so on and so forth. And there, I think the picture is growingly getting better in Europe, especially partly because these private sector sides are recognizing that it's important to work together with the government, but it's also partly because that the EU Europe at EU's level has adopted sort of all EU directive, Network Information Security Directive, that has required sort of put in a standard for all, and each country, of course, has then had to require to look into it, how to apply that directive at home, so to say. And that is very, very good. I feel this is exactly where the normative power of Brussels comes in a positive side, because it creates a sort of like single standards space in Europe, and it creates a situation where you increase the overall security by making sure that your whole is only as strong as the weakest link, and even the weakest link should apply or have the qualify, follow the rules, so to say. So very specifically, the rules are set in to inform the government about incidents. The rules are set in for the government to decide, first of all, define what are its essential services, and then in turn define what are the basic IT security baseline for those basic services. This sort of like directive creates the power, gives mandate to EU countries to demand more. Of course, when you demand, there is the question of, as I said before, you need to have a trust relationship, as it needs to be a two-way street. So the question is, when the government demands, what it can give back in return. And I think essentially three things. So when looking at the private sector, there are three things that the government can do. The first is the threat picture that I referred to before. Sort of government has in its power sort of like this data about different private sector actors, and it can generalize and feed it back to them. The second is that the government can do is build skills through both providing workshops, conferences, exercises, but also basic rules for the benchmark reforms. And thirdly, awareness raising. That's what the government can do.
Thanks, Mel. Another question to both of you, beginning with Pauline. In the European Union, and Pauline, you follow what's going on in Brussels still, I know, very closely. There's been a lot of debate about reshoring, about supply chain security. Some people even sort of talk about it as a new form of autarky, that, you know, the lesson of resilience is that we've got to be able to produce our own medicines, our own paracetamol. We have to regain control of the critical supply chains. We can't depend upon foreign technology like Huawei 5G equipment because of the security risks. Is it necessary to go to a kind, and I'm being a bit, of course, a bit provocative here, but is it necessary to go towards a kind of new form of autarky stroke autonomy, or can we still have resilience and still benefit from the direct foreign investment, the sharing of technology that have characterized globalization? So what's your take on this sort of globalization versus autarky debate, Pauline?
Well, I think we've hitherto had globalization without regard to security. I think what's become clear is that security does have a legitimate place in how we conduct our international trading systems. And it's in the area of data that the problem really arises. I think we're going to find that governments increasingly are not only interested in export control, but also in rules for inward investment. Now, I think that I think is where the nub of the problem lies. I would like to see inward investment rules of a kind which discriminate between those things which are really hardcore central to the security of the nation and to its technological prowess. And these aren't quite the same thing. We do need actually to be able to safeguard our capacity actually to generate intellectual property. And some of that has security implications. Some of it does not have security implications, but has wealth implications. And national security and wealth are now, and the national prosperity agenda and the national security agenda are very closely related. It requires, I think, very great judgment. I think it's an extremely difficult challenge where to strike the balance between those things that we decide do need to be on a national or a friendly national international basis, i.e. among allies, and those things which we should hope to help maintain a framework of globalized trade. So I think we face a challenge. I don't think we can go on as we are, but I would not want to see us develop what you rightly say will be autarky. We will be poorer. Actually, the world would not be more secure.
Thanks, Pauline. Very
because we would have as a result.
Merle, thank you. Merle, we've got just a minute or so left, unfortunately, but do you share Pauline's view, and what do you think how far should the EU go, do you think, as part of its sort of strategic autonomy plan to sort of have more sort of European technology or more European solutions to the resilience challenge?
I think EU is right in imposing or adopting its own norms for its own space, and at times and at parts I see that working as a gold standard for countries outside the EU as well. I've come across governments in Latin America or Eastern Partnership countries who may not want to join EU, but still are looking at the EU cybersecurity or privacy rules so that as an attractive sort of model or template to follow. Regarding the sort of globalization vis-a-vis autocracy that you mentioned, I think I see COVID not so much changing the whole global supply chain, but as accelerating it. So I see the pandemic as a catalyst that amplifies several long-term trends. And one area where this choice is visible and where I very much agree with Baroness is an approach taken towards foreign investors looking to pluck broken companies in the pandemic-induced economic environment. After the last economic crisis or the financial crisis, we saw lots of Chinese firms, for example, who ventured out to acquire various discounted assets around the globe. And I'll wonder whether that's the case now and how nations decide about where they want to let in foreign investors. So there should be a healthy balance in between global trade, but also defining very, very clearly what are the strategic areas for foreign investors where countries, and I think here countries have a voice rather than the EU to decide where investors can be let in and where not.
Thank you. So Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, Merle Maigret, thank you very much indeed. I had lots more questions on my list. I wanted to ask you about fake news. I wanted to ask you about the role of the military, but I'll have to sort of persuade you back for another strategic conversation soon so that we can complete that agenda. But my takeaways are that we need to have a good articulation of what the national level does and what the EU level does. We need not to break our economic model and globalization, but think more intelligently about where security fits in. We need more situational awareness, that's for certain. And we need to step up ever more the dialogue between the private sector and government. So lots of material for our next tabletop exercise at Friends of Europe, which we hope can go back to being person to person. But if not, we will do it virtually as we've had the conversation today. But again, I'm extremely grateful to both of you for giving us your time, but above all, giving us generously of your brain power and expertise. I learned a lot, and if that's the case, I'm sure that our audience have learned a lot as well today too. So on behalf of Friends of Europe, your good friends of Friends of Europe, please stay that way. And again, look forward to having you back soon and lots of other things to talk about. But bye for now from Brussels. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.